When incest produces fatal syndromes, the consequences echo through generations and devastate entire families. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the secluded mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the Harland family's history lay hidden for decades before it was finally brought to light in 1967. The Appalachian Hills, with their thick forests and deep valleys, provided the perfect refuge for communities wishing to remain separate from the rest of society. On these steep slopes, about 50 kilometers from the nearest town, lived the Harland family, a lineage tracing back to the region's first European settlers in the 18th century. Dr. Robert Caldwell, a country doctor who served Kentucky's most remote communities, was the first to document the case. In his own words, recorded in his medical journal, "Never in my 35 years of medicine have I seen such a concentration of congenital anomalies in a single family. The Harlands seemed to bear the weight of generations of consanguineous unions. Their property was accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound its way up the mountain. Visitors were uncommon, and the family shunned contact with outsiders." When Dr. Caldwell first arrived at the property, answering an urgent call about a child having trouble breathing, he was unprepared for what he would discover. The main house was a worn, two-story wooden structure, surrounded by smaller huts scattered across the land. In all, 32 people lived in that family compound. The patriarch, Jacob Harland, was 68 years old in 1967 and wore a permanently severe expression. His wife, Margaret, was also his first cousin. But it was the third generation that revealed the true impact of their consanguinity. Of Jacob and Margaret's 9 children, 7 had married their own cousins. From these unions came 23 children, 17 of whom had serious developmental issues. Dr. Caldwell immediately noted the distinctive traits: prominent jaws, eyes set very close together, clubbed fingers, and in many cases, severe intellectual disability. The most severe case was Timothy, a 12-year-old boy with Apert syndrome, a rare condition marked by craniofacial malformations and fused fingertips. Timothy was the son of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harland. The boy struggled to breathe and lived in constant pain from brain pressure caused by the premature fusion of his skull bones. The family's geographical isolation was only the start. Over generations, their social isolation had become absolute. Jacob Harland ruled his family with an iron fist, discouraging any contact with the outside world. The children didn't attend school. Modern medicine was viewed with suspicion, and marriages were arranged within the family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob told Dr. Caldwell on that first visit. "Pure blood, without contamination from the outside world." The doctor quickly understood he was confronting an unprecedented case of genetic isolation. Meticulously, he began to document each family member, their kinship ties and medical conditions, creating what would become one of the most significant case studies on the effects of consanguinity in the history of American medicine. Yet what started as a medical case soon expanded into a broader investigation. Local authorities, alerted by Dr. Caldwell's preliminary report, began to question if the children were being denied essential medical care and a mandatory education. In June of 1967, social workers visited the property, accompanied by the local sheriff. What they found was described as medieval conditions. Children with more severe disabilities were kept in separate rooms, some tied to their beds to prevent them from injuring themselves. Medical records were non-existent, and several children had never been officially registered. The case quickly captured the attention of the local press. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story titled "The Forgotten Family of the Mountains," detailing the dire conditions and genetic anomalies found among the Harlands. The reporting carefully avoided sensationalism but made the severity of the situation clear. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Your subscription helps us continue to investigate these hidden stories that shaped entire communities and warn of the real dangers of consanguinity. The Harland story did not begin in 1967. To fully understand how a family reached such a degree of genetic isolation, we must return to the late 18th century when the first Harland arrived in the Kentucky mountains. Ezekiel Harland, a Scottish-Irish immigrant, settled in the region around 1795, seeking to escape what he called the corruption of eastern cities. He purchased 200 acres of mountainous land, built a log cabin, and began raising his family far from the eyes of an expanding society. County historical records show that Ezekiel married his first cousin, Hannah, bringing with him a cultural pattern that was not unusual for the time, especially among isolated communities. In the rural, isolated communities of the 18th and early 19th centuries, marriage between cousins was not only accepted but often encouraged as a way to keep property within families. Local historian Martin Thornberry, who has extensively studied the isolated communities of the Appalachians, explains, "These first colonizing families faced a reality very different from our own. Geographic isolation meant a limited pool of potential marriage partners, and economic considerations often prevailed that are completely foreign to us now." The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, deepened the Harlands' isolation. While Kentucky officially remained with the Union, the region was deeply divided. The Harlands, with their deep distrust of government authority, withdrew even further into the mountains during this turbulent period. It is during this time that the diaries of Josiah Harland, Ezekiel's great-grandson, offer a rare glimpse into the family's mindset. In an entry dated 1863, he wrote, "The world outside is shattering itself in war and madness. Here in the mountains we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." This rhetoric of purity and preservation became central to the Harland identity. With each generation, the isolation became not just geographical but ideological. Children were taught from an early age that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that the family's survival depended on their union, literally. The 1880 census records 18 Harlands living on the original property, now expanded to 320 acres. Of these, 15 bore the Harland surname, suggesting marriages within the family were already commonplace. The census also notes that 3 children were listed as disabled, though it didn't specify the nature of their conditions. The turn of the century brought dramatic changes to rural America, but it barely touched the Harlands. While roads, telephones, and eventually electricity reached increasingly remote communities, the family deliberately remained on the sidelines of this progress. A 1948 report from the Kentucky Electric Company mentions that the Harlands refused the installation of power lines on their property, preferring to continue using kerosene lamps. This technological isolation reinforced their social isolation. Without radios or newspapers, the family remained disconnected from world events. The Great Depression, 2 world wars, these transformative historical events scarcely brushed the closed universe of the Harlands. It was during the 1930s that Jacob Harland, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would meet decades later, assumed leadership of the family. Under his direction, the rules of marriage within the family became even stricter. Local church documents show he formally withdrew his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon where the pastor spoke out against marriages between close relatives. Jacob developed his own religious interpretation based on selective readings of the Bible and family traditions. This homespun religion emphasized lineage purity and cast the Harlands as a chosen people, destined to preserve values the rest of the world had abandoned. The family's isolation was so complete that during the polio vaccination campaigns of the 1950s, health officials didn't even know many of the Harland children existed. Only years later, when records were examined after the 1967 intervention, was it discovered that at least 2 children in the family had died of polio, a disease easily preventable by the Salk vaccine, available since 1955. As we move into the 1960s, we can see how generations of isolation created the perfect conditions for a dangerous genetic concentration. The isolation was no longer just a cultural or geographical choice. It had been inscribed into the Harland family's very DNA. When Dr. Robert Caldwell began systematically documenting the medical conditions of the Harland family members in 1967, he was unknowingly contributing to an emerging field of medicine, population genetics. His meticulous records, preserved today at the University of Kentucky, offer one of the most complete case studies on the biological effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Harland family is not simply an isolated case of cousin marriage, but the cumulative result of generations of consanguinity, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who studied the case in the 1970s. It's like watching centuries of compressed genetic evolution in just a few generations. To understand what happened to the Harlands, we need to look at the basics of genetics. Every person carries 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from their mother and one from their father. Many defective genes are recessive. Their effects only show when a person inherits 2 copies of the defective gene, one from each parent. In genetically diverse populations, the chance of 2 partners carrying the same defective recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives have children, that probability increases dramatically because they share a significant amount of their genetic material. First-degree cousins share approximately 12.5% of their genes. When they marry, the chance of their children inheriting 2 copies of the same defective recessive gene is much higher than in the general population. When this pattern repeats for generations, as it did with the Harlands, the result is an increasing concentration of deleterious recessive genes in the children. Among the Harland children, Dr. Caldwell documented a striking array of rare genetic conditions. Beyond Timothy's Apert syndrome, there were cases of polydactyly, extra fingers or toes, in 6 children, syndactyly, fused fingers, in 4 children, retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative retinal disease leading to blindness, in 3 teenagers, cleft palate in 5 children, and varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14 children. Particularly remarkable was the case of identical twins James and John Harland, born in 1955. Both had a rare form of disproportionate dwarfism known as spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. This condition, characterized by a short trunk and limbs and spinal problems, is caused by mutations in the COL2A1 gene, which codes for type 2 collagen, an essential protein for bone and cartilage development. These twins represent one of the clearest cases of recessive genetic expression I have observed, Dr. Caldwell noted in his records. Their condition is so rare that the likelihood of it occurring by chance in a non-consanguineous population would be practically zero. The impact of consanguinity wasn't limited to visible physical conditions. Later studies of the Harland medical records revealed an abnormally high incidence of congenital heart disease, kidney problems, and rare metabolic disorders. The family's average life expectancy was significantly lower than the national average, just 47 years for men and 51 for women, at a time when American life expectancy was already surpassing 70 years. One of the most alarming findings came when Dr. Caldwell examined the family's own unofficial birth records. Of 49 documented pregnancies between 1945 and 1967, 14 ended in miscarriage, 7 in stillbirth, and 3 in neonatal death within the first weeks of life. These numbers represent a gestational loss rate 3 times higher than the national average at the time. Can you imagine the silent suffering of these women? Losing child after child without access to proper medical care, believing these tragedies were simply God's will. Leave a comment saying what a preventable tragedy to show how genetic education could have saved so many lives. The phenomenon observed in the Harlands has a scientific name: inbreeding depression. This term describes the reduction in biological fitness of a population resulting from the accumulation of harmful genetic traits due to breeding between genetically similar individuals. In her definitive report on the family, published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1973, Dr. Simmons wrote, "The Harlands represent an involuntary natural experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The genetic consequences observed in this family offer undeniable evidence of the biological risks of close-kin marriage over multiple generations." She continued, "Particularly notable is the prevalence of conditions that typically occur at frequencies of less than 1 in 100,000 in the general population. In the Harland family, we find multiple cases of these conditions in a group of just 32 individuals. For the Harlands, these were not abstract statistics but daily lived reality." Elizabeth Harland, one of the few adults in the family who cooperated extensively with researchers, described the experience of growing up knowing something was wrong with her family without understanding what. "We always knew we were different," she told Dr. Caldwell. "The way people in town looked at us on the rare occasions we went there, the other children's laughter. Jacob said it was because we were special, chosen. I only realized later it was because we were sick. The discovery of the Harland family in 1967 set off a series of government interventions that would forever change the lives of that isolated community. The case quickly escalated from a medical concern to a matter of child welfare, sparking a debate on the boundaries between religious freedom, parental rights, and the protection of children. In July 1967, a month after the social worker's first visit, the Kentucky Department of Children's Services obtained a temporary court order to examine all Harland children under 18. Jacob Harland's resistance was fierce. "No one will take my grandchildren," he told the sheriff. "God gave us these children to care for and our traditions." The operation to remove the children for medical evaluation required the presence of several state police officers. Witnesses described heartbreaking scenes of frightened children being separated from their parents. For many, it was the first time they had ever left the family property. At the Kentucky Regional Hospital, specialist physicians confirmed Dr. Caldwell's preliminary diagnoses and uncovered additional, untreated conditions. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome, immediately underwent surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain. 3 other children were diagnosed with congenital heart disease requiring surgical intervention. The case quickly became a test for the legal system. In August 1967, the county juvenile court held a custody hearing that lasted 5 days. Experts in medicine, social work, and law testified about the conditions on the Harland property. Attorney Margaret Williams, assigned to represent the Harland children, argued, "These children were deprived not only of adequate medical care, but of the fundamental right to an education and the opportunity to develop as individuals. The isolation imposed on them is not merely physical. It represents a form of emotional and intellectual neglect." The family's defense, led by local attorney Thomas Shepard, countered that the government was improperly interfering with a private religious community that simply wished to live according to its own traditions. "The Harland family represents a disappearing American way of life," Shepard argued. "They have a constitutional right to raise their children according to their religious beliefs." Judge William Harrison faced a dilemma that echoed broader tensions in 1960s American society: the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. His decision, delivered on September 12, 1967, set a significant legal precedent. While this court recognizes the fundamental right of parents to raise their children according to their religious beliefs, stated Judge Harrison, this right is not absolute when it endangers the physical and mental well-being of those children. The evidence presented convincingly demonstrates that the Harland family's practices of endogamous marriage have resulted in significant genetic harm to the children, and that the refusal to seek proper medical treatment has compounded that harm. The court ruled that 17 of the 23 Harland children be placed in temporary state custody for medical treatment and educational assessment. Children with less severe medical conditions could return to their parents after the implementation of a supervision plan that included regular medical visits and school enrollment. The decision triggered protests from conservative religious groups and advocates of individual liberty. The Harland case became a focal point in national debates over the limits of government intervention in family life. Letters to the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal revealed deeply divided public opinion. "What happened to the Harland family is nothing less than government tyranny disguised as compassion," wrote a reader from Frankfort, Kentucky. Another from Lexington countered, "If we allow personal belief to override scientific evidence, how many more children will suffer needlessly?" For the Harlands themselves, the consequences were immediate and traumatic. The family unit, which had persisted for over 150 years, was fractured. Jacob Harland, who had ruled his family with unquestioned authority, saw his world crumble. 3 weeks after the court ruling, he suffered a stroke and died 5 days later. The Harland children, many of whom had never interacted with anyone outside the family, faced enormous challenges adapting. Mary Harland, no relation, a social worker assigned to the case, documented her observations. "The Harland children exhibit extreme separation anxiety and difficulty adapting to new environments. Many show significant social developmental delays, with communication patterns and interactions that reflect their prolonged isolation." Particularly moving was the case of siblings Sarah and Michael Harland, aged 8 and 10. Both had moderate intellectual disability and had never been separated. placed in different adoptive homes due to their specific medical needs, they developed severe regressive behaviors that required intensive psychological intervention. For some of the older children, integration into the outside world brought a mixture of trauma and liberation. Elizabeth Harland, then 16, wrote in a diary that was later included in the case records, "Everything is frightening and strange. The lights are too bright. People talk too fast. But for the first time, I am learning things Jacob would never have allowed us to know. Yesterday, a nurse explained to me why so many babies in our family are born sick or die. It is not God's punishment." Nearly 6 decades after the Harland family's discovery, their case continues to influence medicine, law, and social ethics. The legacy of this family, isolated in the Kentucky mountains, extends far beyond their individual circumstances, offering valuable lessons for contemporary society. Of Jacob Harland's 23 children and grandchildren living on the property in 1967, we can now trace remarkably diverse life paths. Timothy, the boy with Apert syndrome whose condition first drew Dr. Caldwell's attention, underwent surgery and received ongoing treatment. Though he never fully overcame his physical and cognitive limitations, he lived to be 47, far longer than would have been possible without medical intervention. He died in 2002 due to cardiac complications related to his condition. The twins, James and John Harland, with their disproportionate dwarfism, followed surprisingly different paths. John, adopted by a resourceful family in Louisville, received specialized treatments and adaptive education, eventually graduating from high school. He worked for many years as an accountant and became an advocate for disability rights. James, who remained closer to the original community, had less access to treatments and educational opportunities, illustrating how environment can profoundly influence development, even when genetics impose significant challenges. Sarah Harland, one of the youngest children at the time of the intervention, perhaps represents the most inspiring story. Adopted by a family of university professors, she overcame her initial developmental delays and eventually earned a degree in social work. In a remarkable turn, Sarah dedicated her professional career to working with isolated communities in Appalachia, helping to bring education on reproductive and genetic health to populations that, like her biological family, remained on the margins of modern society. "I carry the Harlands not only in my DNA, but in my life's mission," Sarah stated in a rare 2005 interview for a documentary about the case. "Every community I help connect with medical and educational resources represents a family like mine that can be spared unnecessary suffering." From a medical perspective, the Harland case led to significant advances in understanding recessive genetic diseases. The extensive genetic mapping of the family, which began in the 1970s and continued with more advanced technologies in subsequent decades, helped researchers identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. The meticulous records kept on the Harland family have allowed us to track the inheritance of specific genetic mutations through multiple generations, explains Dr. Jennifer Lowe, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. This type of longitudinal study is extremely rare and valuable, offering insights that simply could not be obtained any other way. In 1989, researchers using preserved family DNA samples identified a specific mutation in the FGFR2 gene responsible for Timothy's Apert syndrome. This discovery later contributed to better prenatal diagnostic methods and early interventions for children born with this condition. In the legal field, the case of Harland versus Commonwealth of Kentucky set important precedents regarding the limits of family autonomy when it conflicts with child welfare. Cited in more than 40 subsequent cases involving isolated religious communities, Judge Harrison's decision continues to influence the legal balancing act between religious freedom and child protection. The original Harland property, the subject of legal disputes for many years, was eventually divided among several heirs. The main house, where Jacob Harland once ruled his small, isolated kingdom, was abandoned in the 1980s and destroyed by a fire in 1992. Today, only the stone foundations remain, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, a physical reminder of a way of life that endured for nearly 2 centuries before disappearing. The ethical implications of the Harland case remain relevant in the 21st century. With the advent of advanced genetic technologies and consumer DNA testing, issues of genetic counseling, privacy, and reproductive autonomy have gained new urgency. The Harland case reminds us that scientific knowledge must be democratized, argues Dr. Michael Sanderson, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago. When vital information about genetic health remains concentrated only among the privileged and educated, we perpetuate a system where some communities remain vulnerable to harmful patterns that could be avoided. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Harland legacy is how it illuminates the tension between tradition and progress, between cultural preservation and individual well-being. In isolated communities that still exist around the world, from closed religious groups to geographically remote populations, the balance between respecting traditions and protecting against potentially harmful practices remains a challenge. The Harland story is not simply about the biological dangers of consanguinity, but about how isolation, geographical, educational, and ideological, can create cycles of suffering that transcend generations. At the same time, it is a story about human resilience and the capacity to adapt, even after generations of isolation. In 2015, the University of Kentucky inaugurated the Harland Center for Population Genetic Studies, dedicated to researching rare genetic diseases and developing outreach programs for isolated rural communities. Partially funded by an anonymous donation, believed to be from a family descendant, it aims to transform a legacy of suffering into a resource for prevention and education. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonates with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so we can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel. Check to see if you're already subscribed so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases that reveal the hidden consequences of social and genetic isolation. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories that educate and warn about the real dangers that can hide within isolated communities. Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with anyone you think would also be interested in this remarkable story from American medicine. The Harland case remains a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, when accessible to all, has the power to liberate entire communities from cycles of preventable suffering. In the words of Sarah Harland, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we never had access to. Knowledge would have been our salvation." Today, as we look back on the Harland history, we see not only a family tragedy, but a microcosm reflecting broader questions about how societies navigate the balance between tradition and scientific progress. In a world where isolated communities still exist, where ancient beliefs sometimes clash with modern knowledge, the Harland legacy reminds us of our collective responsibility to ensure that life-saving knowledge is available to everyone, no matter how far they may be from centers of power and education. The story ends, but its lessons remain alive, echoing through generations as a call for compassion, understanding, and the democratization of knowledge that has the power to break cycles of silent suffering.